I think if you think about yourself all the time, and if you're an actor, your inclination is to think about yourself.
Hollywood was never as innocent as it looked on screen. Behind the glamour, the studio contracts, and the carefully managed publicity photos, there was a whole other world. One the studios worked very hard to keep hidden. These women were bold, complicated, and entirely unwilling to live by anyone else's rules. Some paid a price for it, some didn't care. Today we're counting down the 20 most promiscuous women of Golden Age Hollywood. Number 20, Constance Bennett. Before her younger sister Joan became a household name, Constance Bennett was one of the highest paid actresses in Hollywood and one of the most talked about women in the country. Bennett married 5 times, but marriage never really slowed her down between occasions. She had a well-documented affair with the married actor Gilbert Rowland in the early 1930s, a relationship the studio scrambled to manage quietly. Her son Peter, born in 1931, was from her second marriage to millionaire Philip Plant. Rowland she eventually married in 1941, and the two had daughters together. Bennett simply kept working through all of it. She was witty, calculating, and deeply aware of her own value, arguably more so than any of her contemporaries. At her peak in the early 1930s, she was earning around $30,000 a week, a staggering sum for the era, and one that gave her a negotiating position most actresses could only imagine. She used that leverage freely and often, demanding script approval, director approval, and co-star approval at a time when studios expected their contract players to accept what they were given. She lived her personal life with the same disregard for convention that she brought to contract negotiations. Hollywood respected her for the money and quietly gossiped about everything else. She seemed to find the gossiping mildly amusing. Number 19, Paulette Goddard. Paulette Goddard arrived in Hollywood in the early 1930s with very little money and very clear ideas about how to change that. She had charm, beauty, and a practical intelligence that her contemporaries sometimes underestimated. Her most famous relationship was with Charlie Chaplin, whom she may or may not have secretly married around 1936. Neither ever confirmed it clearly, and the ambiguity was almost certainly deliberate on both sides. She lived with Chaplin for years, appeared in 2 of his films, and used the association to launch her own career properly. After Chaplin, she moved through a series of high-profile relationships, including affairs with Clark Gable and Burgess Meredith, whom she eventually married in 1944. Author Erich Maria Remarque, who wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, was another serious companion in Europe, and she married him in 1958, spending her later years primarily in Switzerland. Goddard was smart about money in a way that was unusual for actresses of her era, and she was smart about men in a similar fashion. She collected art seriously. Her collection at her death was valued at several $1,000,000. She never claimed more sentiment about any relationship than she actually felt, which is a kind of integrity that doesn't always get recognized as such. She seemed to genuinely enjoy the men in her life, which was perhaps the most honest thing about her. Number 18, Kay Francis. Kay Francis was one of Warner Brothers' biggest stars in the early 1930s, known for her elegant screen presence and an off-screen life that was considerably less composed. Francis kept a diary, a detailed, candid, and sometimes startlingly explicit record of her romantic life that was discovered after her death. It documented an extensive series of affairs with both men and women, conducted simultaneously and without apparent guilt. Her male conquests included several married men. Her female relationships included figures she coded with initials in the diary, careful never to name fully. The studio knew enough to be nervous. Warner Brothers kept a close watch on her publicity and on what journalists were allowed to ask in interviews. Francis didn't particularly care. She drank, she had affairs, she went to parties that ran too late, and she watched her stardom fade by the late 1930s without much visible anguish. When Warner's wanted to sideline her by assigning her to B pictures, a common studio tactic for managing difficult contracts, she simply fulfilled her obligations and moved on. Her diary, portions of which have been quoted in subsequent biographies by Scott O'Brien and others, is one of the more candid documents from the Golden Age about what actually went on behind the carefully constructed public image. Number 17, Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead didn't hide anything, which in the context of 1930s, Hollywood was either brave or reckless depending on who you asked. The Alabama-born actress had a voice like gravel and an appetite for life that was entirely out of proportion with the era's expectations. She was bisexual and said so, in an age when that word was barely spoken aloud in polite company. She claimed to have slept with hundreds of people over the course of her life, men, women, and at least a few people who were already romantically attached to her friends. Her Broadway career was perhaps stronger than her film work, but she made a significant impact in both. Her 1944 performance in Alfred Hitchcock's Lifeboat earned her the New York Film Critics Circle Award for Best Actress. She was brilliant, destructive, generous, and exhausting in roughly equal measure. Friends adored her and dreaded her calls in equal proportion. "I'm as pure as the driven slush." Tallulah Bankhead. She was not wrong. Number 16. Hedy Lamarr. Hedy Lamarr was introduced to American audiences as the most beautiful woman in the world. A label MGM attached to her when she arrived from Austria in 1937. The label was not inaccurate. What it missed was that Lamarr was also one of the most intellectually restless people in Hollywood, and her personal life was as complicated as her mind. She had fled an unhappy marriage to Austrian arms dealer Friedrich Mandl, a controlling man who reportedly brought her to business meetings as a decorative accessory. By escaping to Paris and then London. She married 6 times in total. In between and around those marriages, she had affairs with actors, directors, and at least one prominent businessman. MGM worked hard to control her image, and Lamarr worked equally hard to live outside it. She is perhaps best remembered today not only for her films, but for her co-invention, with composer George Antheil, of a frequency-hopping spread-spectrum communication system in 1942. The patent expired before anyone recognized its value. The technology eventually became foundational to modern Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. She never received financial compensation for it. Number 15. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford's ambition was the most consistent thing about her. From her early days as a Charleston dancer to her late career horror films, she never stopped pushing, and her romantic life was pursued with the same relentless energy. Crawford was married 4 times, to Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Francho Tone, Philip Terry, and Alfred Steele, and had well-documented affairs in between and around each marriage. Clark Gable was one. Her relationship with him began during the filming of Dance Fools Dance in 1931, and reportedly continued on and off for years. Spencer Tracy was another name that surfaced in various accounts. Her friendship and rivalry with Bette Davis has been documented extensively, but less discussed is the number of leading men Crawford worked with who later described relationships that went beyond the professional. She was also known to pursue relationships with women, though she was careful about how much of that she allowed to be documented. Crawford survived scandals, studio politics, and the brutal transition from silent film to talkies to television. She was difficult, demanding, and genuinely talented. The complicated version of her life is more interesting than either the hagiography or the horror story. Number 14. Clara Bow. Clara Bow was the it girl, literally. The 1927 film, it made her a national sensation and defined a type: spontaneous, magnetic, electric on screen. Off screen, she was all of those things and considerably more. Bow grew up in severe poverty in Brooklyn and reached Hollywood carrying significant psychological damage from a difficult childhood. Fame hit her fast and hard. She was not equipped for it, and the people around her were not particularly interested in helping her manage it. She had affairs with Gary Cooper, Victor Fleming, Eddie Cantor, and Bela Lugosi, among others. She was briefly engaged to actor Gilbert Roland. The attention was relentless. Fan magazines ran fabricated stories about orgies and gambling debts. Her former secretary Daisy DeVoe became the center of a theft trial in 1931 that kept Bow's private life in the headlines for months, and a separate tabloid, The Coast Reporter, ran lurid fabricated stories alongside it. The combined pressure contributed to her decision to leave Paramount in 1931, though she made 2 final films, Call Her Savage, 1932, and Hoop Law, 1933, before retiring from the screen entirely at 28. Bow had made 46 films by the time she walked away. The studio system had extracted everything it could and offered very little protection in return. When the press turned on her, Paramount did not stand behind her with any particular conviction. The tabloid stories were cruel and largely invented. What was real was a young woman who loved freely, lived loudly, and was destroyed by a press that saw her personal life as public property. She married actor Rex Bell in 1931 and moved to a Nevada ranch, largely with withdrawing from public life. She suffered from serious mental health issues in later years, including schizophrenia, and died in 1965 at 60. Hollywood's memory of her has been kinder than its treatment of her ever was. Number 13, Norma Shearer. Norma Shearer had a significant structural advantage in Hollywood. She was married to Irving Thalberg, the head of production at MGM, and arguably the most powerful creative executive in the film industry through the late 1920s and early 1930s. Thalberg was the man who supervised production on films like Grand Hotel, Mutiny on the Bounty, and A Night at the Opera. He was the person that directors, writers, and stars ultimately answered to at the most powerful studio in Hollywood. That marriage gave Shearer first access to the best roles and considerable protection from studio discipline that her colleagues did not enjoy. It also apparently did not prevent her from having outside relationships. She was linked to George Raft and, after Thalberg's death in 1936, pursued a series of relationships with younger men. She had a notable romance with actor and heartthrob George Jessel. James Stewart, then a young contract player, was reportedly one of the men she took an interest in after her husband's death, a pairing that reportedly made the studio nervous given their age difference. Shearer retired from films in 1942 and eventually remarried. She was strategic throughout her career in a way that was almost entirely conscious and deliberate. She understood power and used her proximity to it effectively. Her personal life operated on the same principle. Number 12. Lupe Velez. Lupe Velez arrived in Hollywood from Mexico in the mid-1920s and brought a ferocity of personality that the industry had no real template for. She was loud, funny, temperamental, deeply loving to her friends, and absolutely incapable of being managed. Her most famous relationship was with Gary Cooper, whom she dated intensely and publicly from around 1928 to 1930. The relationship was passionate and volatile in equal measure. After Cooper, she married Tarzan actor Johnny Weissmuller in 1933, a marriage that lasted 6 years and involved a volume of argument that impressed even Hollywood. She had affairs with a series of men both before and during her marriages. She was known for her without apology at a time when that was considered a significant liability for a woman's career. The Mexican Spitfire film series, which she made for RKO through the early 1940s, kept her working even as her status in more serious productions declined. Velez died in December 1944. She was 36. The manner of her death was reported sensationally by the press at the time, and subsequent accounts have corrected much of the mythology that built up around it. What's clear is that she was a woman who had been in the country for nearly 2 decades, had made more than 40 films, and had never been given the kind of dramatic material that matched what she was actually capable of. Hollywood used her energy and her comedy and her looks, and never quite figured out what to do with the rest of her. Number 11. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich arrived in Hollywood in 1930 from Germany, where she had already established a reputation for being impossible to categorize. Director Joseph von Sternberg brought her to Paramount for Morocco, and the film made her an American star immediately. Dietrich was bisexual and conducted relationships with men and women simultaneously throughout her life, often with the knowledge of all parties. She remained technically married to Rudolf Sieber for the rest of her life. They separated in the early 1930s but never divorced, while maintaining a long series of other relationships. Her male relationships included affairs with John Gilbert, Gary Cooper, Jimmy Stewart, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Michael Wilding, and Yul Brynner, among others. Her female relationships included actress Claudette Colbert and several others she was less willing to name publicly. She carried on an extensive and passionate correspondence with Ernest Hemingway, though accounts differ on whether their relationship was ever physically consummated. Dietrich was meticulous about her image and surprisingly candid in private. She was also deeply patriotic toward her adopted country. She became a U.S. citizen in 1939, performed extensively for Allied troops during World War II, and was awarded the Medal of Freedom and France's Légion d'honneur for her wartime contributions. She managed to be simultaneously one of the most desired women in Hollywood and one of the most disciplined managers of her own myth. Her daughter, Maria Riva's memoir, published in 1993, is one of the more detailed accounts of what her personal life actually looked like from close range. Thorough, occasionally startling, and written with clear-eyed affection for a mother who was never simple. Number 10. Gloria Swanson. Gloria Swanson was the definitive star of the silent era, dramatic, maximalist, and operated on a scale that matched the size of her fame. She married 6 times and had an affair that, by any measure, was one of the more consequential of the Golden Age. Joseph P. Kennedy, father of the future president, began a relationship with Swanson in 1928 that lasted approximately 3 years. Kennedy inserted himself into her business affairs, produced several of her films at significant financial loss, and eventually extracted himself from the relationship while leaving her to deal with the resulting debts. Swanson wrote about the affair candidly in her 1980 memoir, Swanson on Swanson, describing Kennedy as a man who confused controlling someone with caring for them. Outside that relationship, she had affairs with directors and co-stars through the 1920s, conducted a life at a scale of luxury that was extraordinary even by Hollywood standards, and reinvented herself for a new generation with Sunset Boulevard in 1950. Her performance as Norma Desmond remains one of the great pieces of screen acting, and one of the more quietly autobiographical. Number 9. Carole Lombard. Carole Lombard was funny in a way that was genuinely rare in 1930s Hollywood. Not decorative funny, not charming funny, but actually instinctively comic in a way that directors trusted and audiences loved. She was also frank about her romantic life in a way that surprised people. She was married briefly to William Powell, and the two remained close friends after their divorce in 1933, an unusual arrangement for the era. She had affairs with Russ Columbo and Gary Cooper before entering a relationship with Clark Gable that became one of Hollywood's great love stories. She and Gable married in March 1939. By most accounts, they were genuinely happy together, a rarer thing in Hollywood than the publicity suggested, and rarer still for two people with Lombard and Gable's respective histories. She called him Pa. He called her Ma. The ranch they bought in Encino became as close as either of them got to something resembling a normal life. Lombard was killed in a plane crash on January 16, 1942, returning from a war bond tour in Indiana. She had sold more than $2 million in war bonds in a single day in her home state. The TWA Flight 3 crashed into Mount Potosi, Nevada, shortly after departing Las Vegas. There were no survivors. She was 33 years old. Gable never fully recovered from the loss. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces not long after and flew combat missions over Germany, a decision widely understood as at least partly driven by grief. Before Gable, though, Lombard was no one's idea of a retiring figure. She was direct, genuinely funny, and entirely comfortable in her own skin in a way that made her impossible to manage and wonderful to be around. People who worked with her consistently described a woman who swore freely, told the truth, and made you feel that life was a better proposition than you had previously suspected. Number 8. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner came from rural North Carolina and arrived in Hollywood in the early 1940s on the strength of a photograph that a talent scout saw in her brother-in-law's studio window. She became one of the most beautiful women ever to appear on screen, a fact she was always slightly uncomfortable with because she knew it was the least interesting thing about her. She married 3 times. Mickey Rooney in 1942, she was 19, he was 21, and the marriage lasted barely a year. Artie Shaw in 1945 and Frank Sinatra in 1951. All 3 ended in divorce. Around and between those marriages, she had affairs with Howard Hughes, Robert Taylor, the Spanish bullfighter Mario Cabré, and Luis Miguel Dominguín, arguably the most celebrated bullfighter of his generation. Dominguín was also romantically linked with Lauren Bacall and Lucia Bosse, which gives some sense of the circles Gardner moved in during her European years. Her relationship with Sinatra was the most intense of her life, and by most accounts, the most damaging, to both of them, but in different registers. Sinatra pursued her with a commitment that bordered on obsession. She found him irresistible and impossible in roughly equal measure. They married in November 1951, shortly after Sinatra's divorce from Nancy Barbado, and divorced in 1957. They remained close for years afterward. Gardner eventually settled in Spain, then London, partly to escape the American press, and partly because she found she preferred life on a different scale. She liked evenings that went on too long, friends who argued about things that mattered, and a general absence of the performance that American celebrity required. She made no particular apology for any of it, which was itself a form of style. I've always been a woman who goes her own way. I never saw the point of being otherwise. Ava Gardner, in a 1974 interview. Number 7. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth was constructed in some ways by the studio system. Her hairline was altered, her name changed from Margarita Cancino, her heritage softened for American audiences. But what the studio couldn't manufacture was the quality she had on screen. A warmth and a sensuality that came through regardless of the material. She married 5 times: Edward Judson, Orson Welles, Prince Ali Khan, Dick Haymes, and James Hill. Welles, whom she married in 1943, described her as a woman the industry had mistreated systematically. Prince Ali Khan, whom she married in 1949, gave her a life of extraordinary luxury that she found largely unsatisfying. Between and around those marriages, she had relationships with Victor Mature, David Niven, and reportedly Glenn Ford, with whom her chemistry on screen in Gilda, 1946, was, by most accounts, not entirely manufactured. Gilda made her one of the defining icons of the era. The image of her in that film became one of the most reproduced photographs of the 20th century. She later said, with some sadness, that men went to bed with Gilda and woke up with her. That gap between image and person was something she never fully closed. Number 6. Jean Tierney. Jean Tierney is perhaps less remembered today than her contemporaries, which is an injustice to one of the more genuinely compelling actresses of the 1940s. Laura, 1944, and Leave Her to Heaven, 1945, established her as a major talent, and her personal life was as dramatic as anything on screen. She had a long affair with John F. Kennedy, then a young naval officer stationed in Washington, that began around 1944 and continued on and off through his early political career. Kennedy reportedly ended the relationship when it became clear his family would not accept a divorced actress as a viable political wife. Tierney described the end of the affair in her memoir, Self-Portrait, published in 1979, with an economy of detail that made it more affecting than a longer account would have been. She also had a relationship with Oleg Cassini, the designer, whom she married in 1941 and divorced in 1952. Her personal life included a tragedy that marked everything that followed. A daughter, Daria, born in October 1943 with severe disabilities including deafness and an intellectual disability, the result of Tierney contracting rubella during her pregnancy from a fan who had broken quarantine to attend a function where Tierney was present. Tierney wrote about the experience in her memoir with careful restraint that didn't conceal the grief underneath it. Serious mental health struggles followed in the mid-1950s, including periods of institutionalization at the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas. She recovered, resumed working, and eventually married Texas oil businessman W. Howard Lee in 1960. She was a complicated, fragile, and genuinely talented woman who lived through more than most people would recognize from the polished surface of her films. Laura alone would secure her legacy. Number 5. Lana Turner. Lana Turner was discovered, according to the studio mythology, sitting at a soda fountain on Sunset Boulevard in 1937. The story was largely promotional. What was real was the impact she had on screen and the genuinely turbulent life she lived off it. She married 8 times to 7 different men. Artie Shaw in 1942, the marriage lasted only 4 months. Stephen Crane in 1942, annulled, then remarried in 1943 after she discovered she was pregnant. Bob Topping in 1948, Lex Barker in 1953, Fred May in 1960, Robert Eaton in 1965, and Ronald Dante in 1969. It is a list that takes a moment to absorb. Around and between those marriages, she had affairs with Frank Sinatra, Tyrone Power, and Howard Hughes, among others. Her relationship with gangster Johnny Stompanato ended on April 4, 1958, when her daughter Cheryl Crane stabbed Stompanato during a violent confrontation at their home. A grand jury ruled the killing a justifiable homicide. Turner's career survived the scandal, in part because the public sympathy was largely with her. Imitation of Life, 1959, released the year after, became one of her biggest commercial successes. She was 39 at the time and gave one of the better performances of her career. She never found a stable personal life. The marriage to Lex Barker ended after Barker allegedly abused Turner's daughter. The marriage to Stompanato never happened, but the relationship was the most publicly catastrophic of her life. She seemed to know that the choices she made in her personal life were not always serving her, and she kept making them anyway. There's something recognizable about that, the gap between what a person knows and what they do. That probably explains why audiences never stopped rooting for her. Number 4. Marilyn Monroe. By the time Marilyn Monroe became Marilyn Monroe, Norma Jean Mortensen had already lived more lives than most people manage. The childhood was genuinely hard. Foster care, instability, and early marriage at 16 to James Dougherty that was partly arranged to keep her out of an orphanage. She married 3 times: Dougherty, Joe DiMaggio in 1954, and Arthur Miller in 1956. DiMaggio loved her possessively. Miller loved her intellectually. Neither knew exactly what to do with her. She had a documented affair with Yves Montand during the filming of Let's Make Love in 1960. Her relationship with President John F. Kennedy was widely reported and largely confirmed by subsequent accounts, including by people close to both of them. The studio system treated her as a commodity for most of her career, and she spent significant energy pushing back against that. She founded Marilyn Monroe Productions in 1955, studied at the Actors Studio, and delivered performances in Some Like It Hot, 1959, and The Misfits, 1961, that showed a depth she was rarely given credit for in her own lifetime. She died on August 4, 1962. She was 36. The official cause was acute barbiturate poisoning. The circumstances have been debated ever since. Number 3. Bette Davis. Bette Davis wanted to be taken seriously in an industry that preferred its women beautiful and uncomplicated. She was beautiful, but uncomplicated she was not. She married 4 times: Harmon Nelson, Arthur Farnsworth, William Grant Sherry, and Gary Merrill. She had well-documented affairs during and between each marriage. Her relationship with co-star George Brent developed during the making of several films in the early 1930s and is confirmed in multiple biographies. Director William Wyler, with whom she made Jezebel, 1938, and The Letter, 1940, was another significant relationship, one she described as the most artistically important of her life. Davis fought the studio system at Warner Brothers in 1936, traveling to England to try to break her contract and arguing that the roles she was being given were beneath her abilities. She lost the lawsuit but won the long argument. The studio began giving her better material, and she won Academy Awards for Dangerous, 1935, and Jezebel, 1938. She was nominated for the Academy Award 10 times in total, which was a record for many decades. She delivered some of her most memorable work in All About Eve, 1950, a film that felt almost personal given its subject matter. A younger, ambitious woman systematically working to displace an established star. Davis reportedly understood the parallel without needing anyone to point it out. She and Joan Crawford's mutual animosity is well documented and was real. What drove it was partly competition, partly genuine temperamental incompatibility, and partly the fact that Hollywood in the 1930s had room for one dominant female star at a time, and neither of them was willing to step aside. Number 2. Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn was married once, briefly, to Ludlow Ogden Smith in 1928, divorced in 1934, and spent the rest of her life conducting relationships on her own terms and nobody else's. Her relationship with Spencer Tracy began during the filming of Woman of the Year in 1941. Tracy reportedly said, upon meeting her for the first time, that she was a little tall for him, and she is said to have replied that she was sure she could cut her down to size. And it lasted until Tracy's death on June 10, 1967, 26 years later. The relationship was conducted largely in private, structured around Tracy's marriage to Louise Tracy, whom he never divorced. Louise Tracy had founded a school for deaf children in Los Angeles, and by most accounts was a woman Tracy respected deeply, even as he spent much of his life with someone else. Katharine Hepburn has said she respected the marriage and maintained the relationship within those limits. Others who knew them well described something rather less restrained and rather more consuming on both sides. Before Tracy, she had relationships with producer Leland Hayward, agent-turned-mogul Howard Hughes, and writer-director John Ford. Hughes reportedly proposed marriage. Hepburn declined. Ford's feelings for her appear to have been deep and unreciprocated in the way he wanted. Hepburn won 4 Academy Awards, more than any other actor in history, for Morning Glory, 1933, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, 1967, The Lion in Winter, 1968, and On Golden Pond, 1981. She worked consistently for 6 decades and gave almost no interviews about her private life. She was known for being difficult and worth it in roughly equal measure, and she seemed to enjoy the reputation. What we know about her personal life comes mostly from other people's accounts and from her own memoir, Me, published in 1991, a book that is characteristically frank about some things and characteristically silent about others. She describes Tracy with great love and very few specifics. She describes Hughes as someone she could have married but didn't, and leaves the reasons somewhat open. The book is very much hers in that way, illuminating and incomplete in exactly the proportions she chose. Number 1. Mae West. Mae West walked into Hollywood in 1932 at the age of 39, an age at which most actresses of the era were already being phased out, and proceeded to single-handedly save Paramount Pictures from bankruptcy. She had written her own material on stage for years. Her Broadway plays, including Sex, 1926, which she wrote, produced, and starred in, resulted in her arrest and an 8-day jail sentence on charges of obscenity and corrupting the morals of youth. She served the time and emerged with considerably more publicity than she had going in. Her first film, Night After Night, 1932, gave her a small role that she rewrote substantially on her own initiative. Her second, She Done Him Wrong, 1933, was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture and made her one of the highest paid people in the United States. I'm No Angel, 1933, followed the same year and was equally successful. The Production Code, which the Hays Office began enforcing seriously from July 1934, was aimed substantially at curtailing exactly what Mae West did on screen. Her dialogue, her delivery, her entire persona were the kind of thing the Code's authors had specifically in mind when they wrote their prohibitions. She adapted because she was always smarter than the people trying to contain her. Her films after 1934 had to work harder to deliver the same effect with more restricted material, and they mostly succeeded, though the later work never quite had the velocity of She Done Him Wrong or I'm No Angel. Off-screen, West had a long-term relationship with boxer William Jones, known as Chalky, that lasted for decades, a relationship she maintained with total discretion despite living the rest of her public life in complete transparency about her attitudes towards men, and conventional morality. She wrote her own films, controlled her own image, and outlasted every moral panic directed at her. She worked into her 80s. She died in 1980 at 87. If there was one woman in Golden Age Hollywood who lived entirely on her own terms, from beginning to end, it was Mae West. These 20 women lived in an era that required them to be one thing on screen and something else entirely in private, and most of them refused to cooperate fully with that arrangement. Some paid for it, some thrived because of it. All of them left behind something more interesting than the carefully managed image their studios preferred. Hollywood has always been a place where the mythology and the reality run alongside each other without quite touching. The women on this list are a reminder that the reality was always the better story. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe. There's a lot more Hollywood history coming, and you don't want to miss it.